Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz. Recently, I have been spending a considerable amount of time thinking about and doing research on AI, artificial intelligence, and what it is likely to do to our cultures. And the more I've thought about it, the more I have become convinced that one of the keys to the future and dealing with AI is dealing with human creativity, intuition, and innovation. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And it's going to be a two-parter. I'm going to talk about it. And then on the second part, I'm going to teach you a series of techniques for allowing your own creativity to come out. So first, we're going to give you some context. And second of all, I'm going to teach you techniques for allowing your own creativity to express itself. When you think about these creative events that change history, what you discover is they come in the night or unexpectedly on a walk on a park or playing games with a friend or in meditation. Not at all what you'd expect. That is the provenance of creative breakthroughs that have changed the course of human history. These intuitive, creative insights of single men and women that alter the whole course of human development. Example, Nikola Tesla's invention of the electric motor at the end of the 19th century came in a vision as he was walking across a city park in New York. Mozart and Copland had music come to them in an instant. Einstein saw relativity after he had been sick and was idling away at afternoon in a canoe. And he had this kind of vision. He later wrote, and this is a quote, "I believe in intuition and inspiration. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world. It stimulates progress, gives birth to evolution, and it is, strictly speaking, a real factor in scientific research." Now, that's a quote from a man who is regarded as one of the great intellectuals in human history. So one of the things that you become clear as I did this research was that creativity concerns both the individual and the society, and that our survival as a species is determined by our creative solution of problems that are so well known that reciting them would be a cliche. Our proficiency in understanding the creative process and our success in nurturing its dynamic in our culture is going to determine the role we and our values and our culture play in the world, whether our vision or another directs the course of future events. And as you look at what's going on in the world, you look at what China is doing, for instance, leading the way in so many areas, and we are no longer a leader in so many areas. You realize that these shifts occur in history in large part because of creativity. I hadn't really fully appreciated that until I put in this research. But one does not need to be sophisticated in historical analysis to recognize the impact a single creative individual can have on society, how harmful suppression of creative initiative is to both individuals and the society. These are the issues which should be in the forefront of our awareness as we push forward and we deal with AI, because it's going to affect our understanding of the world. And I really, as a person who has been doing research in this for many years, has not really fully appreciated both the potential and the threat that AI poses. So how great can the contribution of a single individual be, really? Well, I want to give you an example that is sufficiently removed in time and by a person you've probably never heard of to show you how this really is possible and how a single individual can change the whole course of his country. I'm speaking here of a German chemist named Paul Ehrlich. This single man and the teams he led were responsible for a long list of pharmaceutical breakthroughs, including the first synthesis of a quinine substitute, a cure for sleeping sickness, and the most effective pre-antibiotic cure for syphilis. And although Ehrlich died in 1917, so great was the creative momentum that his work and his team produced that the historian Henry Hobhouse noted, and this is a quote, "In explosives, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, the synthetic substances of all kinds, the German chemical industry was able to survive the defeat of World War I, poor government, the inflation of the 20s, the depression, largely because of the technological lead derived from Ehrlich and his pupils. Today, information is available at a rate unimaginable 20 years ago. It's become possible to buy a digital file that has everything about a culture that can be reduced to digital data. I mean, think about that. 20 years ago, you couldn't do any of this. Now, you can get everything about a culture that can be made digital. It's literature, it's history, it's statistics, it's arts. You can go up and do a search on Google, for instance, and find out stuff that 20, 30 years ago you couldn't have found anywhere except if you'd been given access to the personal files or something. If we believe the words of Einstein and Mozart and others, however, now that this digitalization of culture is possible, it is very clear quite quickly as you do the research that the relationship between non-local consciousness and intellect is a relationship that is critical, that holds the key to our future. Consider this description of Brahms, who was describing his act of composition of music. He said, "In this exalted state, I see clearly what is obscure in my ordinary moods. Then I feel capable of drawing inspiration from above, as Beethoven did. These vibrations assume the form of distinct mental images, and straightway the ideas flow in upon me. Not only do I see distinct themes in the mind's eye, but they are clothed in the right forms, harmonies, and orchestration. Measure by measure, the finished product is revealed to me when I am in these rare inspired moods. I have to be in a semi-trance condition to get such results, a condition when the conscious mind is in temporary abeyance and the subconscious is in control, for it is through the subconscious mind, which is part of the omnipotence, that the inspiration comes." Now, that was an articulation of non-local consciousness, non-local perception, decades before science understood non-local consciousness. For instance, I'm one of the people that created something called remote viewing. It's a technique for accessing non-local consciousness. It's called remote viewing. And when ordinary people are asked to carry out a remote viewing task, something which involves the location of something or a person or a place, something that they couldn't possibly know, that from which they're separated by space or time. We have discovered in our research in remote viewing, the group of us that have been doing this for the last 50 years, that it is possible for people to access anything, any kind of information. It's telling us that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that what we are dealing with is information, a domain of information that is outside of space-time. So, as we explore that and seek to understand that, we begin to get a sense of how humanity and creativity can function differently than artificial intelligence, which can gather all of the factual information available, but so far as we know, cannot access non-local consciousness. I want to give you an example of how this plays out and why it's important. A researcher named Douglas Dean, working with another man named John Michalowski at the Newark Institute of Technology, carried out a series of experiments involving 385 chief executive officers of American corporations. They got these 385 CEOs who agreed to participate, and they asked them to precognitively predict 100 randomly selected numbers. And then the results were correlated with the financial reports on those corporations. And what they discovered was that in every experiment, a positive correlation, that is, the CEO got the numbers that he was asked to predict correct, that when they were successful at doing this precognitive non-local perception task, that their corporations had a higher level of financial performance, and that the correlation was so strong that Dean, and I knew this man well, he was a very careful researcher, that Douglas Dean was able to examine the financial reports of a corporation and predict how the CEO would do based on his next financial annual report. They got so good at this that they discovered that those CEOs that were really good at doing these precognitive tasks produced better financial performance. So as our technology increases and the role of creativity and its relation to non-local consciousness becomes better understood, we will see that accessing this part of ourselves, particularly as AI develops and threatens to dominate human culture, that this ability to access the non-local is going to become more and more important. Next week, I'm going to go through this process and show you a technique which you can learn and do, a 6-step process that will allow you to express your own creativity. And it is in the expression by many individuals of their creativity that humanity will remain dominant in its own future. For the past 40 years, I have been searching, as I told you, the biographies, the autobiographies, contemporary accounts of friends, of men and women to whom the title creative genius has been unequivocally awarded. These are the people that stand out in history uniquely: the Einsteins, the Mozarts, the Curies, the Brahms, the Picassos. And while we are only beginning to understand this creativity, what has already become clear to me as I have looked at this is that there are 6 major components to the pattern of all these creative breakthroughs, whether it's in the arts, in the sciences, in medicine, that when you talk to the people who actually do this, or you read what they wrote down at the time, what you see again and again are 6 recurring patterns that seem to comprise the pathway to these creative breakthroughs. The first is the mastery of their field. Whether it's physics or sculpture, individuals of genius are masters in their field. So whatever it is they're doing, they're very good at it. They're thinking visionaries, intellectually on the leading edge, whose analytical prowess, whose intellectual prowess, gives them the power to define the problem they want to address. Yet it does not mean necessarily they're the smartest people. And this really surprised me. As I was doing this research, I thought, well, they're the highest IQ but I went out once for dinner in Los Angeles with the late Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, one of the great physicists of the 20th century. And I was doing this kind of research already, and I said to Richard, well, I assume that you're so successful because you're so smart. And he laughed and said to me, oh no, it is not that simple. He said when he was at university, he snuck in to the dean's office and looked at his college file and learned that his IQ was only 124. Now that's superior, a level attained by less than 5% of the population, but it would hardly be considered an indicator of an internationally recognized and historically significant physicist. Intelligence is needed, but creativity is more than a function of working at full potential than just having the highest IQ. One correlation that does seem to hold was described by Dr. Mervyn Friedman at San Francisco State College, a conclusion that he reached after studying the relationship between IQ and creative process. And Dr. Friedman said, and I quote him, observations indicate that the more creative individual students tend to be more troublesome to the average teacher than other students. Now, who would have thought that that was one of the signs of significant creative ability? But he said it's a finding which by itself urges a better understanding of the creative dynamic, so that our educational system does not dismiss troublesome individuals who it turns out are simply bored. Now think about that for a minute. Have you ever sat through a class and just gotten bored because it's moving so slowly and you've already figured out the point that the teacher is trying to make? Well, that makes a difference. And that tells us something about how we ought to be educating. Edward Land, the inventor of the Polaroid process, at the end of his career, re-examined the work of hundreds of scientists and engineers in his firm. And I came across this study, and I was surprised. He concluded that the most significant discoveries were made by some individual, this is a quote, by some individual who has freed himself from the way of thinking that is held by friends and associates who may be more intelligent, better educated, better disciplined, but who have not mastered the art of the fresh, clean look at old knowledge. Thomas Kuhn, perhaps the leading historian and philosopher of science in the 20th century, said almost the same thing. He pointed out that most scientists, what's important to them is that they be accepted by their peer group, that they not take on or say things which seem to be contradictory to what the peer group understands. And I can tell you from personal experience in my research into non-local consciousness that materialist scientists don't like to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't like to read about it. And so the commentaries that you get when anybody asks them about non-local consciousness research is literally, it's impossible. And yet we have thousands of experiments, studies, which show not only that it does exist, but that it can do all kinds of useful things. So strong is this iconoclastic factor that it's become part of our folklore, in fact. It's part of the cultural stereotype about creative scientists. You know, we think of them as eccentric individuals who do odd things, dress strangely, whatever. And like all such myths, there's some truth in it. However, such an evaluation is too coarse to detect the central point. A considerable body of research exists suggesting that creativity is in some way a function of focus. That's what does come across, that people who have creative breakthroughs obtain a way of focusing. Now, this focus can be in several ways. Through neurosis, which I think is what causes the eccentric genius idea, so an obsessional focus, or through a dedicated, consciously assumed focus, as in meditation or any of the martial arts. Because as a culture, however, we don't provide effective and systematic training to achieve that kind of focus. And it's clear in my research that one of the things that we ought to be teaching in schools is meditation. How to attain intentioned, focused awareness. Now, this neurotic focus is also part of history, I discovered as I did this research. Nikola Tesla, who I mentioned last week, discovered the electric motor, was one of the towering figures of early 20th century science. But he had a fear of germs that was so great that he demanded that everything on his table be sterilized and that he have at least 24 napkins put on the table next to him when he sat down to eat. So that's a form of neurotic focus. Einstein, in contrast, is more a kind of meditative focus. Why do many geniuses cling to debilitating idiosyncrasies? Perhaps without consciously understanding the relationship. They're afraid if they give up their obsessions, they'll lose their focus and their creative powers. And that also feeds the idea of the eccentric genius. But the key to what they're actually doing is that they have a way of developing a intentioned, focused awareness. So the second point. First, you have to master your field, whatever it is. And the second point is the deep knowing that a solution to the challenge does exist. Now, this is actually, you would think this would be obvious. It's not. When you read the biographies, the correspondence, the various records that scientists and artists and musicians leave, you become aware that even though they don't have the solution they're seeking, they are convinced, as opposed to just having faith. They believe that a solution does exist. Einstein put it this way, and I quote him, I feel certain I am right while not knowing the reason. This knowingness could be described as a leap of faith. The third step, you develop a technique for a strategy for inward lookingness. You develop some kind of technique of inward looking, some way of connecting with the factor that lies outside the purview of the intellect, the non-local aspect of consciousness. And here again, the focus is the central point. Historical accounts, laboratory research, both suggest that meditation, gardening, even sports, such as darts, strangely, can fulfill this portion, this way of attaining focus. Years ago, when I was covering the early phases of the space program for the National Geographic Society, I visited Cape Canaveral. And while I was walking down the hall, happened to see a group of engineers that I had been talking with earlier engaged in a dart game. Later that evening, I happened to be seated next to one of those engineers at dinner, and I teased him about spending the day at darts. And he responded that it was the team's secret weapon, and that far from just wasting their time with darts, that this was the technique that they used to solve problems. He said, when we get stuck and no intellectual solution suggests itself, we begin playing darts. And at first, the conversation's about trivial things, but after a while, someone is likely to offer a solution to the problem that we face. And a little while later, someone else will add something, and suddenly, as if a spark has caught a fire, we will all start talking about the problem again. And I don't know quite why, but we get focused on it, and many insolvable problems have been solved this way. So darts are an important part of the space program. And this dart game is a variation of something experienced by all who strive for creative breakthroughs. Clearly, understanding this promise or this process holds substantial promise for learning. Yet the idea of openly espousing and training students or research teams in techniques which would increase their ability to focus is virtually unknown in the educational and scientific worlds. And so I would say again, I think we should be teaching meditation, non-religious meditation techniques in school, because the research shows that when children begin to do these kinds of tasks and they learn how to attain intention-focused awareness, less trouble, less violence in the school, less dropouts, higher engagement, greater creativity, higher grade scores. Now, you would think that that would encourage the teaching of meditation, non-religious meditation, intention-focused awareness. But it doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that we really have to change. The fourth point of the 6 steps, I call it surrender. It's a surcease from intellectual struggle. One reaches the eye of the intellectual hurricane in order and still can't get it, and stops thinking, oh, it must be a certain way, or the answer I'm seeking must fit in with what we already know. And you surrender to any possibility. And it leads to this kind of inner listening, which allows these creative breakthroughs to occur. Darwin, for instance, describes how years after collecting data, one day while he was relaxing and away from his working place, the whole idea of the key issues of evolution fell into place in an instant. And he was so startled by this that he recorded it, and I found it when I was doing research. Alfred Wallace, who arrived at much the same conclusions as Darwin, at almost the same time, had a similar experience. After collecting specimens in all over the world, in the Malay archipelago particularly, he contracted a fever. And after days of semi-delirium, just like Einstein in his canoe after an illness, he experienced a breakthrough in which the basic principles of evolution's gradual change suddenly emerged in his rational mind. The French mathematician Jules-Henri Poincaré reported that on 2 occasions, major breakthroughs seemed to come from thin air, he said, quote unquote, once when he was walking across the street. Given the commitment to this, could we in fact develop training processes which would create the conditions for creative breakthroughs? And that's what I was saying. I think we can, and I think we must. Research, particularly since the mid-70s, suggests a sound scientific basis for approaching this process exists, and that meditation, which is normally associated with religion, but which is in fact a way of focusing consciousness. Now, you go up to my website or you go to at the end of this podcast, you'll see meditation for modern minds. And that's a technique for developing intention-focused awareness that I developed originally for remote viewing, but which I have learned subsequently is a technique for meditation that can produce all kinds of insights. Even the sleep state has its role to play in surrender and inward looking. Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, A Child's Garden of Verses, Treasure Island, says that before he went to sleep, he would give himself the suggestion, I quote, "The gremlins of my mind would help me write a story while I slept." And that worked. Jonas Salk, who I got to know slightly, one day walking across the Salk Institute campus, he said, I asked him, "Where did you get the idea for the polio vaccine?" And he said, "In a dream." And then he later wrote, "Intuition is something we don't understand the biology of yet, but it's always with excitement that I wake up in the morning wondering what my intuition will toss up to me like gifts from the sea. I work with it. I rely upon it. It's my partner." And I understood from the research that we're doing in remote viewing in dream states exactly what he was talking about. That you can use your dream state by giving yourself suggestions that will give you insights. French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, who is considered the seminal figure in the emergence of modern philosophy and science, and who linked geometry and algebra, said that on St. Martin's Eve, November the 10th in 1619, he had a series of 3 dreams. And out of that, as he put it, a marvelous science, a worldview whose hallmark was its commitment to the primacy of intellect, a view which he said guided him, emerged out of those dreams. Now, when people do these techniques, mastery, surrender, a technique for focusing intentioned awareness, there comes to be a moment of illumination, and that's the 5th step. And even the most cursory analysis of the anecdotal or controlled intuitive experimentation produces numerous subjective accounts of this suddenly seeing. It's so powerful that I was at dinner in London with Arthur Koestler, the famous writer, and he coined the term holons, Holons, to deal with this sudden impouring of comprehension that Einstein and Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart all experienced. But then there is a final step. The sixth step is intellectual explication and verification. So you have this moment of illumination, but you must then go back and demonstrate for others why this is accurate. Descartes, for instance, who I mentioned just a moment ago, gives a clear example of this process. He says, after these dreams, it took him the rest of his life to make the vision intelligible to others. So you have to develop the experiments. You have to develop the formulas. You have to develop the paintings, whatever it is you're working in. But what is clear is that these 6 steps describe a natural rhythm which will allow you, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, if you master these 6 steps, you develop the daily practice of meditation so that you can attain intention-focused awareness. You can produce creative breakthroughs, whatever it is you do. And I leave you with this thought, that this is very important to learn. And it's very important for us as a culture to teach. Because as AI develops and commands more and more information, we're going to come to a point where we are faced with artificial intelligence. Does artificial intelligence dominate our culture? Or does human creativity and insight dominate it? And we are just entering that path, as you can see and read in all this research and all the commentary that's going on about AI, whether it's doom or whether it's a great future. Which path is going to be taken? And I suggest to you that the path to take is that humans develop and as a culture cultivate creativity and insight and understanding. Thank you.